Richard Sterling thought the divorce was already over. He had the high-priced legal team, the ironclad prenup, and the arrogance of a man who had never lost a deal in his life. When he saw his wife Kaylee walk into the courtroom without a lawyer, he actually laughed out loud. He leaned over to his associate and whispered, "This is going to be a slaughter." But the smile was wiped from his face the moment Judge Harrison took the bench. He didn't ask Kaylee where her lawyer was. Instead, he looked at her with terrified recognition and called her name. What happened next wasn't a trial. It was an execution. The air in courtroom 4B of the Superior Court of Cook County smelled of stale coffee and expensive cologne. It was a scent Richard Sterling loved. To him, it was the smell of victory. Richard adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke Brioni suit, checking the reflection of his Patek Philippe watch in the polished mahogany table. He was 45, handsome in a jagged, predatory way, and currently the CEO of Sterling Halloway Holdings, one of the largest commercial real estate firms in Chicago. He was worth on paper just over $80 million, and he was about to make sure his wife Kaylee didn't get a dime of it. "She's late," Arthur Caldwell muttered, checking his own watch. Arthur was Richard's lead counsel, a man whose hourly rate could feed a family of 4 for a month. He was a shark in a pinstripe suit, known for burying opponents under mountains of paperwork until they suffocated. "Let her be late," Richard chuckled, leaning back in his chair. "Probably trying to find a parking spot for that beat-up Honda I let her keep. Or maybe she's crying in the bathroom. Honestly, Arthur, I almost feel bad for her. Almost." Richard glanced at the empty table across the aisle. It looked pathetic. Just a bare wooden surface, 2 empty chairs, and a silence that screamed defeat. "Remind me again," Arthur said, leafing through a 3-inch thick file. "Who is representing her?" The notice of appearance was blank. "That's the point," Richard grinned. "She doesn't have anyone. I froze the joint accounts 3 weeks ago. She can't afford a retainer for a decent lawyer, and she's too proud to go to legal aid. She thinks she can talk to the judge, cry a few tears about the emotional abuse, and get a payout." Richard's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "She doesn't get it. This is the big leagues. We aren't arguing over a dog or a timeshare. We are arguing over my empire, and she is walking in here with a slingshot." The heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open. Heads turned. The court reporter looked up from her machine. The bailiff, a burly man named Officer Miller, who had seen it all, shifted his stance. Kaylee Sterling walked in. She didn't look like a woman who had spent the last month sleeping on her sister's couch, though Richard knew for a fact she had. She wore a charcoal grey dress that was simple conservative and completely unbranded. Her hair, usually worn in the loose, wavy style Richard liked, because it made her look like a trophy, was pulled back into a severe tight bun. She carried no purse, no tissues, just a single battered brown leather briefcase that looked like it had been bought at a thrift store in the 1990s. She walked down the center aisle. She didn't look at the gallery. She didn't look at the bailiff. And most infuriatingly, she didn't look at Richard. "Look at her!" Richard snorted loud enough for the few spectators to hear. "Walking in like she owns the place. Sad." Kaylee reached the plaintiff's table. She set the briefcase down with a heavy thud. She pulled out the chair and sat placing her hands flat on the table. She was perfectly still. Arthur Caldwell, however, wasn't laughing. He frowned, squinting at Kaylee. He nudged Richard. Is that the briefcase she usually uses? What, who cares?" Richard dismissed him. "It's probably full of romance novels and tissues." No. Arthur whispered, a strange tension entering his voice. That leather. The wear pattern. It looks like an old litigation bag. Did she ever work? Richard laughed, a harsh barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Work, Kayleigh. Please. I met her when she was a junior copy editor at a publishing house making 30 grand a year. She quit 2 weeks before the wedding. Her job for the last 10 years has been planning charity galas and spending my money. She doesn't know a tort from a tart. Just then, the door to the judge's chambers opened. All rise, Officer Miller bellowed. The Honorable Judge Anthony Harrison presiding. The room stood. Judge Harrison was a legend in Chicago family law. He was 65, with eyebrows like steel wool, and a reputation for having absolutely zero patience for theatrics. He was known as the Butcher because he tended to cut through nonsense arguments with brutal efficiency. Richard had paid a lot of money to ensure their case landed on Harrison's docket, knowing the judge favored hard contracts and prenups over emotional pleas. Judge Harrison took his seat, arranging his robes. He put on his reading glasses and looked down at the docket. Case number 24-D-1098. Sterling versus Sterling, the judge read. His voice was gravel. He looked up, his eyes scanning the room. First, he looked at Richard's table. He nodded at Arthur. Mr. Caldwell, good to see you. And you, Your Honor, Arthur said smoothly. Then the judge looked to the left. He looked at the woman in the grey dress. Richard smirked. He waited for the question. Mrs. Sterling, where is your counsel? Mrs. Sterling, do you understand the proceedings? But the question never came. Judge Harrison froze. His hands, which had been shuffling papers, stopped mid-air. He squinted, leaning over the bench as if he couldn't believe his eyes. He took his glasses off, wiped them on his robe, and put them back on. The silence stretched for 10 seconds. It was uncomfortable. Richard shifted, confused. Why was the judge staring at his wife? Then Judge Harrison spoke. But his tone wasn't authoritative. It was stunned. Miss Devereux. Richard blinked. Devereux. That was Kayleigh's maiden name. She hadn't used it in 10 years. Kayleigh stood up slowly. Her posture changed. The submissive, quiet housewife Richard had bullied for a decade evaporated. In her place stood someone taller, colder. Good morning, Judge Harrison, Kayleigh said. Her voice was different. It was deeper, resonating from the diaphragm, projected perfectly for the acoustics of the room. I am appearing on my own behalf today. And yes, for the record, I will be using my professional name, Kayleigh Devereux. The judge let out a breath that sounded like a whistle. He looked at Arthur Caldwell. He looked back at Kayleigh. Then a small, terrifying smile touched the judge's lips. I wasn't aware you had returned to the practice, Miss Devereux. I haven't, Your Honor, Kayleigh said, unbuckling the battered briefcase. Not until this morning. Richard leaned over to Arthur, panic flickering in his chest for the first time. What is he talking about? What practice? She was an editor. Arthur Caldwell had gone pale. He was staring at Kayleigh with the look of a man who realizes he has brought a knife to a nuclear war. Richard, Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. You told me she was a copy editor. She was at Simon & Schuster or something. No, Arthur hissed. I think your wife is the Kayleigh Devereux. Who the hell is Kayleigh Devereux? Richard demanded. Arthur didn't answer. He just watched as Kaylee pulled a single thick document from her bag and laid it on the table. She didn't look at Richard. She looked at the judge. "Your Honor," she said, "I have a motion to dismiss the prenuptial agreement on the grounds of fraudulent inducement, racketeering, and gross concealment of assets, and I have the forensic receipts to prove it." Richard's laugh died in his throat. To understand the magnitude of the silence that fell over the courtroom, you have to understand the decade that preceded it. Richard Sterling was a man who collected things. He collected vintage Porsches. He collected commercial properties in gentrifying neighborhoods. And 10 years ago, he decided to collect a wife. He met Kaylee at a fundraiser in New York. She was 26, quiet and strikingly beautiful in an understated way. She was standing by the bar sipping club soda, looking slightly bored. Richard approached her with the confidence of a man who owned the building they were standing in. He asked her what she did. "I'm in publishing," she had said. "I work with text, fixing mistakes." Richard heard what he wanted to hear. Publishing, text, low salary, artsy. Perfect. He didn't ask which firm. He didn't ask what kind of text. He assumed she meant novels or magazines. He wooed her with dinners at Le Bernardin, weekends in the Hamptons, and gifts of diamonds that cost more than her rent. Carly was hesitant at first. She seemed to study him, her green eyes calculating in a way he mistook for shyness. Eventually, she agreed to marry him. But there was a condition. Richard insisted on a prenup, a brutal one. "It's just business, darling," he had told her, sliding the document across the mahogany desk in his study. "My board of directors insists on it. If we divorce, you leave with what you came with. It protects us both." Kaylee had read the document. It was 50 pages long. It stipulated that if they divorced, she would receive a lump sum of $50,000 for every year of marriage, capped at $500,000. No alimony. No claim to his real estate. No claim to his future earnings. She had looked at him then, a strange expression on her face. "You really don't trust anyone, do you, Richard?" "I trust contracts." He had smiled. She signed it without asking for a lawyer to review it. Richard had bragged about that to his friends for years. She signed it blind. That's how much she loves me, or how stupid she is. For the next 10 years, Kylie played the part. She redecorated the penthouse. She hosted the dinners. She listened to Richard rant about his business rivals, nodding in all the right places. But Richard was a narcissist, and narcissists are blind to everything that doesn't reflect them. He never noticed that when he talked about complex tax loopholes, Kaylee understood them instantly. He never noticed that when he brought legal briefs home from the office, she would glance at them and point out typos that were actually critical clauses which would have exposed him to liability. He treated her like a beautiful lamp. You don't ask a lamp about its history. He didn't know that before she was in publishing, Kaylee Devereaux had graduated first in her class at Yale Law. He didn't know that she had spent 3 years at the Southern District of New York as a prosecutor, specializing in white-collar financial crimes. He didn't know that she had left the law, not because she couldn't hack it, but because she had burned out after a case where the defendant, a corrupt billionaire real estate developer, had threatened her family. She had gone into publishing legal textbooks to hide, to breathe, to live a quiet life. She had fallen in love with Richard because he seemed strong, safe, and successful. She thought she could leave the Shark Tank behind, but over the years she watched. She watched Richard berate waiters. She watched him cheat his contractors. She watched him hide money in shell companies in the Caymans. She watched him flirt with his assistants, and eventually she found the texts that proved he was sleeping with them. The final straw came 6 months ago. Richard had come home drunk and laughed about evicting a retirement home because he wanted to turn the building into luxury condos. Loophole in the lease, he had bragged. Kicked the old bats out on the street. Legal said it was tight. Kaylee had looked at him, and the love she had once felt turned into cold, hard ash. She didn't scream. She didn't fight. She went to her separate bedroom, opened her laptop, and logged into the American Bar Association website to reinstate her license. Then she started digging. Back in the courtroom, the atmosphere had shifted from a civil hearing to a gladiatorial arena. Arthur Caldwell was frantically texting his junior associates. Search Kaylee Devereaux. Now. Yale. SDNY. Find everything. Richard was still confused. Arthur stopped texting and object. She can't just throw papers at the judge. Shut up, Richard. Arthur snapped, sweat beading on his forehead. Judge Harrison was reading the document Kaylee had handed him. His eyebrows climbed higher and higher. Ms. Devereaux, the judge said, looking over his glasses. This is a forensic audit of the Cayman holdings known as Blue Heron LLC. Yes, Your Honor, Kaylee said calmly. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back. My husband claims his net worth is $80 million. He claims Blue Heron LLC is a defunct entity with no assets. However, if you turn to page 14, you will see a wire transfer initiated 3 days before he filed for divorce. Richard's heart slammed against his ribs. Blue Heron. How did she know about Blue Heron? That was buried 3 layers deep in shell companies. The paperwork was in a safe in his office. The transfer, Kaylee continued, her voice cutting through the air like a scalpel, was for $12 million. It was moved to a bank in Liechtenstein. The signatory on the account is not Richard Sterling. It is a man named Marcus Vance. Kaylee paused for effect. She turned her head just an inch to look at Richard. It was the first time she had acknowledged him. Her eyes were empty of warmth.